The streets of Victorian London in winter were not just cold, they were oppressive, suffocating, and often deadly. Imagine standing on cobbled roads where fog clings to your clothes, soot settles on your skin, and the icy air pierces through the thin layers of wool that many could barely afford. These winters were far harsher than most people today can imagine, and the very rhythm of life, from the way people worked to the way they slept, was dictated by the unrelenting cold. The 1800s in London coincided with what historians call the Little Ice Age, a period where winters were longer, harsher, and far more unpredictable than they had been in centuries. While summer offered a brief reprieve, winter gripped the city for months on end. Temperatures routinely dropped below freezing. Rivers and canals iced over, and a heavy, thick fog laden with coal smoke blanketed the city. London's infamous pea soup fogs were most dangerous in winter, when the cold air trapped pollution close to the ground. Breathing this mixture of smoke, soot, and moisture was suffocating, and it carried with it an invisible threat: disease. Housing in Victorian London was woefully inadequate. The wealthiest citizens could afford heated homes with coal fires burning day and night. But for the majority, the poor and working class, warmth was a luxury they could seldom enjoy. Many families lived in single-room apartments, often overcrowded and damp. These rooms, poorly insulated against the biting wind, were freezing at night, and the constant dampness made them breeding grounds for illness. Families huddled together for warmth, but even human body heat could not fully protect against the relentless cold. Coal was the primary source of heat, but it came at a cost. For the poor, burning coal meant emptying what little they had on fuel, sometimes skipping meals to keep the home slightly bearable. Smoke from coal fires inside poorly ventilated homes led to respiratory problems, while smoke from the thousands of chimneys outside covered streets in a thick, black haze. The combination of freezing temperatures and suffocating smoke created an environment that was as unhealthy as it was cold. Food scarcity was another brutal reality of winter. During the harsh months, fresh vegetables were scarce and expensive. Meat was often out of reach for the poorest citizens. And even bread, the most basic staple, could fluctuate in price dramatically depending on the season and harvest. Malnutrition was common, weakening bodies and making people more susceptible to diseases that winter brought in its wake. Hospitals were few and often overcrowded, leaving many to fend for themselves or rely on charitable organizations that were overwhelmed by the scale of need. The poor were not the only ones affected, though. Even the wealthy, while insulated from extreme hardship, could not escape entirely. London's streets became treacherous with ice, and travel, whether by foot, horse, or carriage, was slow and dangerous. Accidents were common, and winter storms could isolate entire districts for days. The frost made simple tasks, like fetching supplies or going to work, an ordeal in itself. The class divide in coping with winter was stark. Wealthy families had servants, central heating in some cases, thick carpets, and warm clothing made from wool, fur, and silk. Poor families, on the other hand, often wore clothes patched repeatedly, wrapped in whatever fabric could keep them marginally warm. Children and the elderly were particularly vulnerable. A weak child could succumb to hypothermia or an infection contracted because of prolonged exposure to cold, while older adults struggled with conditions like rheumatism, which worsened in freezing temperatures. The city itself seemed to conspire against its residents. Streets were narrow and poorly maintained, and the combination of ice, mud, and horse manure made travel perilous. During heavy snow, transportation virtually halted. Markets struggled to operate, deliveries failed, and workers who depended on daily wages found themselves without income. Many resorted to desperate measures, taking risks that further endangered their lives. Disease was an almost constant companion during winter. Influenza swept through homes and workplaces alike, claiming hundreds of lives. Cholera, though more common in warmer months due to contaminated water, still lurked, taking advantage of overcrowded living conditions and poor sanitation. Pneumonia, tuberculosis, and other respiratory illnesses surged when the cold and damp attacked already weakened bodies. Hospitals were overwhelmed, and physicians often had little more to offer than supportive care. Many families lost members, and funerals became a grim part of the season's routine. Industrial London added another layer of challenge. Factories continued to operate through snow and frost, often exposing workers to extreme cold for long hours. Children in factories or street jobs were especially at risk. In some textile mills or foundries, temperatures inside were paradoxically hot from machinery, but the journey to and from work exposed them to the freezing outdoors, compounding health risks. Exposure to these conditions for prolonged periods left many permanently weakened, both physically and mentally. Despite the hardships, Londoners found ways to endure and even find brief moments of joy. Ice skating became a popular pastime when ponds and rivers froze solid. Seasonal fairs, markets, and Christmas celebrations offered temporary escape from the harsh reality. Pubs provided warmth and community, although alcohol only temporarily eased the physical suffering of the cold. Literature and periodicals often reflected the stark realities of winter, but they also provided distraction and entertainment, a small comfort in otherwise relentless conditions. Personal diaries and letters from the time reveal a vivid picture of struggle. One letter from a factory worker describes trudging through knee-deep snow with frostbitten fingers, longing for the warmth of home that was little more than a cold room. Charles Dickens, in his novels, often highlighted the misery of London's poor during winter, painting a scene of overworked, underfed, and frozen individuals struggling to survive in a city that seemed indifferent to their suffering. As winter dragged on, the combination of cold, disease, malnutrition, and overcrowding created a lethal environment. It was not merely discomfort that people endured, it was a constant negotiation with survival itself. Every day brought decisions that could mean life or death: how much coal to burn, whether to risk venturing outside, how to feed a family when resources were scarce. Victorian London's winters were deadly not because of a single factor, but because of the way cold amplified every other danger in the city. As the frost tightened its grip on London, daily life became a negotiation with the cold. Work continued, but every journey outside was fraught with danger. Streets, narrow and often poorly maintained, became treacherous with layers of ice, snow, and mud. For those who relied on foot travel, even a short walk could be life-threatening. Slipping on hidden patches of ice, falling into frozen puddles, or being struck by a runaway horse-drawn carriage were constant hazards. In winter, London was as much a battlefield against the elements as it was a city of industry and commerce. Factories, workshops, and markets operated without pause. The industrial heart of London depended on the labor of thousands, and winter made their daily struggle far more intense. Workers, including children, endured freezing temperatures both outdoors and indoors. Textile mills, metalworks, and coal yards provided little insulation from the cold. Even inside, drafts from poorly constructed buildings seeped through every crack. Machines generated heat, yes, but the journey to the workplace, trudging through snow and wind, often left workers sick before their shift even began. Street vendors faced an even harsher reality. The freezing air, combined with low demand in winter, meant many could barely sell enough to survive. Fishmongers, coal sellers, and vegetable vendors often risked frostbite just to earn a few coins. The snow and ice slowed deliveries from countryside markets, and the streets themselves were clogged with frozen mud, horse manure, and thick coal smoke, making every step treacherous. Poverty in winter created a cycle of danger, one that trapped the poorest Londoners in an almost inescapable struggle. Transportation itself became a perilous undertaking. Horse-drawn carriages were the primary mode for longer journeys, but icy streets and hidden obstacles caused accidents. Trains, still relatively new in the 1800s, faced delays or cancellations during heavy snow, leaving travelers stranded. River transport on the Thames slowed dramatically when ice formed, cutting off vital supplies. Even walking to work could take hours longer than usual, and each trip exposed pedestrians to the bitter cold, frostbite, and illness. Crime, unfortunately, surged during winter. The harsh weather amplified desperation. Theft became more common as people stole coal, food, or clothing to survive. Burglaries and petty street crime increased as families sought warmth and sustenance. Nighttime brought added danger. Without modern streetlights, dark, icy alleys became hunting grounds for opportunistic criminals. Many Londoners had to navigate a city where the cold was not the only threat. Desperate people and opportunists added to the constant risks. Children were especially vulnerable. Street urchins, often sent to beg or work from sunrise to sunset, faced extreme exposure. Frostbite, hypothermia, and malnutrition were daily threats. Schools, where they existed for the working class, often lacked heating. The combination of poor clothing, long hours outdoors, and insufficient nutrition created a deadly mix. Victorian social reformers noted that children were the silent sufferers of winter. Many would not survive without charitable aid or the luck of surviving mild spells. For the adults, coping mechanisms were improvised, sometimes ingenious, sometimes desperate. Families layered clothing, stuffed newspapers into boots, or built makeshift curtains to keep drafts at bay. The bedbox method, huddling together under heavy blankets, was common among poorer families. Even these measures, however, offered only partial relief. Extended exposure to extreme cold still left many weak, sick, or dead. Heat, when available, was rationed carefully. Coal was precious, and families often burned whatever combustible material they could find. Newspapers, wood scraps, or even furniture sometimes ended up in the fireplace. Ironically, the very fuel that warmed homes also contributed to indoor air pollution, aggravating respiratory conditions. The balancing act of maintaining warmth without suffocating in smoke was a constant concern. Dietary challenges intensified the struggle. Fresh vegetables were rare and expensive in winter, while meat, eggs, and dairy were often unaffordable for the working class. Bread became a staple, but even that could be difficult to obtain if deliveries were disrupted by snow or ice. Many families relied on soup kitchens or charitable aid to survive. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, leaving even healthy adults more susceptible to influenza, pneumonia, and other winter illnesses. The social fabric of London also shifted in winter. Public spaces, like churches, pubs, and libraries, became refuges for those seeking warmth or community. Religious institutions often organized feeding programs or temporary shelters. Pubs offered warmth and companionship, although they provided little more than temporary relief from the harsh cold. Even entertainment was a form of survival. Skating on frozen ponds, attending winter fairs, or gathering for storytelling offered psychological comfort, a brief escape from the relentless misery. Medical care remained rudimentary. Physicians were overworked and under-resourced, hospitals were overcrowded, and treatments were often limited to supportive care. Home remedies, hot broths, wrapping in blankets, or alcohol were common, but they did not prevent frostbite or hypothermia. Cholera, influenza, tuberculosis, and pneumonia claimed lives relentlessly, often with little warning. Winter was not just a season, it was a silent predator stalking the vulnerable. Letters and diaries from the time describe a city on edge. One account details a mother walking 5 miles through icy streets to fetch coal, her children clinging to her skirts for warmth. Another recounts the joy of a rare sunny winter afternoon, a brief reprieve from the cold that made daily survival feel momentarily possible. Writers like Charles Dickens captured these realities vividly, describing the streets filled with coughing, shivering children and adults, desperate for work and food. These narratives offer insight into the human cost of London's winters, beyond mere statistics or weather records. Even the Thames, lifeblood of London, became a symbol of winter's cruelty. When ice formed, river trade slowed, supplies became scarce, and accidents increased. Fishermen, dock workers, and sailors faced freezing water and wind, their livelihood dependent on survival against elements that could easily kill. River ice also contributed to flooding when thawing occurred suddenly, creating another layer of winter-related hazards. Industrial expansion, while transforming London into a global economic hub, magnified winter's impact. Factories and workshops ran continuously, producing wealth but at the expense of human health. Children laboring in textile mills or coal yards were exposed to both industrial hazards and freezing cold. Adults worked long hours in poorly heated spaces, often falling sick without compensation or leave. Winter intensified these struggles, making survival a daily calculation of risk, effort, and endurance. By midwinter, London had a rhythm dictated by frost, ice, and fog. Streets emptied as soon as darkness fell, fires burned day and night in homes, and the poorest families relied heavily on charity. The combination of environmental challenges, human poverty, and social inequality created a deadly cycle. Every snowfall, every icy night, every long walk to work could determine whether a person survived to see spring. Winter in Victorian London was more than just bitter cold. It was a season in which disease thrived and death became a constant companion. The city's infrastructure was ill-equipped to deal with the combination of cold, damp, and overcrowding. Streets overflowed with waste, while rivers and canals, already polluted, froze or slowed, preventing proper sanitation. In homes, damp walls and poor ventilation created the perfect environment for respiratory illnesses to spread rapidly. Influenza swept through families like wildfire. Pneumonia, tuberculosis, and other pulmonary conditions claimed victims silently but relentlessly. Cholera, although most prevalent during warmer months, remained a threat even in winter. Overcrowded homes, contaminated water, and malnourished citizens meant that diseases had a foothold in the poorest communities year-round. Hospitals were overwhelmed, understaffed, and often lacked basic supplies. Visiting a doctor was expensive and sometimes futile. Families relied on homemade remedies, prayers, and hope. Cold homes and limited nutrition only worsened the outcomes. The mortality rate among the poor spiked during winter months. Frostbite and hypothermia were silent killers. For children, prolonged exposure to cold could be fatal, and malnourished adults were even more vulnerable. One diary entry from 1847 recounts a mother who lost 2 children within days, both succumbing to illness exacerbated by cold and insufficient food. Stories like these were tragically common. Government response, while improving over time, was slow and often inadequate. Public health initiatives were limited, and sanitary reforms took decades to implement effectively. The Poor Law offered some assistance, but many families avoided workhouses, fearing the stigma and harsh conditions inside. Charity organizations stepped in where government aid lagged, offering soup, blankets, and temporary shelter. These measures saved lives but could never reach everyone in need. In the midst of hardship, people found ways to endure and sometimes even thrive. Seasonal fairs, skating on frozen ponds, and communal gatherings provided brief respite from the cold. Churches played a central role in supporting the vulnerable, offering warmth, food, and spiritual guidance. Pubs became hubs for survival as well as social interaction, though alcohol offered only temporary relief from frostbite and hunger. Personal accounts bring winter to life in ways statistics cannot. One worker wrote about navigating the icy streets for hours just to earn a few coins, frostbitten fingers clinging to what little warmth his body could muster. Another recounted the terror of a frozen canal, where children playing on the ice risked breaking through thin patches of frozen water. These narratives reveal not just the physical challenges, but the emotional weight of surviving winter in a city that seemed indifferent to human suffering. Children bore the brunt of the cold. Orphans and street urchins often slept in alleyways or abandoned buildings, their tiny bodies vulnerable to frostbite and illness. Many succumbed to cold-related illnesses before reaching adulthood. The Victorian obsession with child labor only exacerbated the problem, forcing young bodies to endure hours in harsh outdoor conditions or freezing factory floors. The Thames, the lifeblood of London, became both a source of livelihood and danger. River workers faced freezing waters and harsh winds daily. Ice made navigation difficult, disrupted trade, and caused accidents. Yet for those relying on the river for work, survival depended on confronting the winter head-on no matter the risks. Even the wealthier classes were not immune to winter's deadly effects. Slipping on icy streets, getting trapped in snowstorms, or contracting illnesses in poorly heated homes were constant threats. While they had access to better nutrition, warmer clothing, and medical care, the city's harsh winter environment spared no one entirely. Frost and fog were impartial in their cruelty. Reports from newspapers, periodicals, and social reformers documented these challenges. Writers highlighted the suffering of the poor, the gaps in government support, and the human cost of industrialization combined with brutal winters. Dickens, in particular, painted vivid pictures of shivering children, exhausted laborers, and overcrowded homes. These accounts were not just literature. They were social documentation, urging reforms that would slowly improve life for future generations. The psychological toll of winter was immense. Extended darkness, damp conditions, and the constant threat of illness created chronic stress. Families feared not only the cold but the ripple effects it caused. Missed work, scarce food, and the ever-present risk of losing loved ones. Winter was not just a physical challenge, it was a mental and emotional ordeal, shaping the way Londoners lived, thought, and acted during the darkest months of the year. Survival often depended on ingenuity and resourcefulness. Families repurposed household items for insulation, collected scrap fuel, or pooled resources with neighbors. Community networks became essential, as no one could endure winter entirely alone. The human spirit persisted, but it was tested to its limits. By the end of winter, London was a city marked by loss and endurance. Streets cleared, rivers thawed, and markets slowly returned to life. Yet memories of the hardships lingered. Stories of suffering and survival passed down through families, letters, and newspapers. Victorian winters left scars not just on the bodies of those who endured them, but on the city itself, shaping policies, culture, and literature for decades to come. The deadly winter of 1842, for instance, became infamous. Thousands were reported dead or severely ill. Coal and food shortages were extreme, and the city struggled to maintain basic services. Public awareness of winter's danger grew, slowly prompting reforms in housing, sanitation, and public health that would eventually mitigate but never entirely eliminate the risk. Even in the harshest winters, Londoners sought ways to endure and find moments of warmth, light, and community. The city, frozen and fog-laden, became a paradoxical blend of danger and resilience. Survival demanded more than physical strength. It required creativity, adaptability, and a deep sense of social connection. Public spaces played a critical role in winter life. Churches were more than religious centers, they were shelters, community kitchens, and social hubs. Many offered hot meals and blankets to those without adequate heat at home. Clergy and volunteers distributed coal, clothing, and sometimes even medical advice, easing the burden on families struggling to survive. These acts of charity, though small compared to the scale of need, saved countless lives. Winter fairs and seasonal markets became vital not just for commerce, but for morale. Skating on frozen ponds and rivers provided both exercise and entertainment. These outdoor activities were among the few reprieves from the relentless cold, and they fostered a sense of community. Children laughed and slid across ice, oblivious, for a few hours, to the dangers that winter otherwise imposed. For adults, these moments were opportunities to socialize, exchange news, and briefly escape the pressures of survival. The pub, too, served as an essential refuge. In dimly lit rooms, heated by coal or wood, people gathered to share food, drink, and stories. Ale, wine, and spirits offered temporary warmth and comfort. Though it did little to counteract the long-term effects of exposure or malnutrition, pubs became informal centers of information, where news of work opportunities, market conditions, and social events spread. In winter, social networks were as crucial as coal for survival. Literature and storytelling also provided mental refuge. Newspapers, serialized novels, and pamphlets flourished, offering distraction and insight. Writers like Charles Dickens, Elizabeth Gaskell, and others highlighted the realities of winter poverty, illness, and danger while also revealing the small joys, acts of kindness, and human resilience that allowed people to endure. Stories of heroic survival, charitable deeds, and the endurance of children became both cautionary tales and sources of hope. Victorian culture also embraced winter rituals that provided psychological comfort. Christmas celebrations, for instance, became increasingly elaborate during the 1800s. Decorations, feasts, caroling, and gift-giving offered respite from the dreariness of cold, grey streets. For the wealthy, these celebrations were luxurious affairs with warm houses, lavish meals, and entertainment. For the poor, even modest festivities, shared bread, a small candle, or a communal song provided a sense of warmth, both physical and emotional. Music and theater flourished despite winter's harshness. Traveling performers, orchestras, and small theatrical productions offered distraction from daily suffering. Theaters provided warmth and a brief escape from the streets, creating a rare space where the city's struggles could be temporarily forgotten. Even the working class occasionally found small moments of pleasure in attending performances or listening to street musicians in central squares. Children's play adapted to winter's challenges. Sledding, ice skating, and snowball fights were dangerous but common, while those unable to venture outdoors often played with improvised toys or gathered indoors in communal spaces. Play was not just amusement, it was essential for maintaining physical health, social bonds, and mental resilience during months dominated by cold, darkness, and scarcity. Winter work rituals also reflected adaptation. Markets adjusted hours to daylight, factory schedules accounted for weather disruptions, and street vendors developed strategies to protect their goods from frost and snow. Coal merchants wrapped shipments in straw or fabric, bakers stored flour in insulated containers, and butchers sometimes braved frozen streets to deliver essential supplies. Every aspect of commerce was shaped by the season, demanding ingenuity and persistence from both sellers and buyers. The city itself adapted slowly. Street lighting improved, helping prevent accidents on icy roads. Pavements were patched, drainage systems gradually upgraded, and some public shelters were created to provide temporary refuge for the most vulnerable. Progress was slow, but these incremental changes reflected recognition of winter's deadly impact and a societal commitment, however limited, to mitigate its effects. Winter illnesses and fatalities remained constant reminders of danger, yet cultural memory preserved resilience. Diaries, memoirs, and letters detailed not only loss, but also ingenuity, kindness, and endurance. One diary from 1853 recounts neighbors pooling coal and food, working together to keep children warm while an elderly resident cared for the sick. Acts like these were repeated across the city, creating a network of informal support that was as vital as any government intervention. Education, though disrupted by winter, continued to adapt. Some schools provided additional indoor activities, lessons by candlelight, and basic meals to protect children from extreme cold. The Victorian emphasis on morality and industriousness extended into winter. Children were expected to attend school or work despite hardship, creating a paradox of education, labor, and survival. The press amplified both fear and awareness. Newspapers reported freezing temperatures, accidents, and deaths, but also offered advice, tips for heating homes efficiently, preventing frostbite, and securing food supplies. Information became a critical tool for survival, shaping behavior and fostering communal resilience. Awareness of risk allowed Londoners to take precautions, though it could not eliminate the dangers entirely. By the late 1800s, Victorian London had developed an intricate winter culture, a combination of survival strategies, seasonal leisure, communal support, and cultural rituals. These adaptations reflected human ingenuity in the face of relentless environmental and social pressures, even as cold, disease, and scarcity persisted. The city's inhabitants demonstrated remarkable resilience, forging routines and traditions that helped them endure and, in some cases, thrive despite winter's deadly grip. Winter left a lasting imprint on Victorian society. It influenced architecture, clothing, urban planning, social reform, and literature. The memory of harsh winters inspired campaigns for better housing, improved sanitation, and public health reforms. Cultural rituals, from Christmas festivities to winter sports, reflected both survival instincts and a desire to reclaim joy amid adversity. In short, winter shaped the very character of London, leaving an indelible mark on its people, infrastructure, and collective imagination. Winter in Victorian London was not a single, abstract concept. It was lived, experienced, and remembered through countless personal stories. Diaries, letters, and newspaper accounts provide a window into the human cost of the season, showing that survival was never guaranteed, and even small comforts could feel monumental. One particularly harsh winter in 1842 became notorious for its relentless cold. Temperatures plummeted, rivers froze, and streets were coated with thick ice. People reported waking to find their homes enveloped in frost. Windows cracked from the cold, and fires unable to keep pace with the biting chill. Coal shortages made matters worse, and for those without access to fuel, freezing homes became death traps. Entire families were affected, children shivering in corners. Elderly parents huddled under thin blankets, and working adults weakened from prolonged exposure. In the diary of a young factory worker, we read of a mother who walked miles through snow to deliver coal and food to relatives. Her fingers and toes were frostbitten, her body weak from malnutrition, yet she persisted. Across the city, similar stories unfolded daily. Laborers trudging through frozen streets to reach factories, street children scavenging for scraps, and midwives navigating icy alleys to reach the sick. Winter demanded courage, endurance, and often sacrifice. Accidents were commonplace. Ice-covered streets were treacherous, leading to falls that could result in broken limbs or worse. Horse-drawn carriages frequently slid on frozen roads, causing injuries or fatalities. Even those accustomed to the city's daily hazards found winter exceptional in its cruelty. Fishermen on the Thames risked life and limb to navigate frozen waters, while dockworkers endured exposure to icy winds and freezing water, often with minimal clothing or protection. Disease compounded these dangers. Influenza, pneumonia, and tuberculosis were rampant. Overcrowded homes facilitated rapid transmission, while hospitals struggled to cope. In 1853, a winter influenza epidemic swept through the city, claiming thousands of lives, particularly among the poor and elderly. Public health interventions were limited, and many deaths went unrecorded, leaving families to grieve privately. The cold itself, hypothermia, and frostbite added to the grim toll. Some survivors bore permanent scars, such as lost fingers or toes, as reminders of winter's harshness. Yet, amidst suffering, small acts of humanity persisted. Neighbors shared coal and firewood, pooled food supplies, and offered shelter to the most vulnerable. Churches and charitable institutions distributed meals, blankets, and clothing. Volunteers braved icy streets to help those in need. These acts of solidarity, though sometimes modest, were vital for survival. They created a fragile network of support that extended across neighborhoods and social classes, proving that winter's cruelty could be mitigated by human compassion. Notable events punctuated Victorian winters, capturing public attention and shaping cultural memory. The frost fairs and the frozen Thames were both spectacle and survival. Merchants set up temporary stalls on the ice, selling food, drink, and trinkets. People skated, played games, and celebrated the rare opportunity of a frozen river. Yet even these fairs were dangerous. Ice could crack unexpectedly, and participants risked falling into freezing water. The frost fairs symbolized both the beauty and peril of winter, a fleeting joy against a backdrop of constant struggle. Children's experiences were particularly harrowing. Orphans and street urchins often faced entire nights exposed to the elements. Even indoors, overcrowded homes and poorly heated rooms left them vulnerable. Schools attempted to continue, but attendance dropped during severe weather. Stories from the era reveal children wearing layers of patched clothing, working long hours, and surviving on meager rations, all while braving the dangers of ice, snow, and disease. Yet, children also displayed remarkable resilience, finding ways to play, form communities, and support each other through the harsh months. The wealthy, too, faced challenges, though less severe. Icy streets, disrupted transport, and occasional illness reminded them that winter spared no one entirely. Yet their access to fuel, nutritious food, clothing, and medical care allowed them to endure conditions that would devastate the poor. The contrast between rich and poor in winter underscores the broader social inequalities of Victorian London, where survival often depended as much on class as on courage or ingenuity. Literature immortalized these struggles. Dickens' novels frequently depicted children and adults battling cold, hunger, and disease. Elizabeth Gaskell and other writers emphasized the human cost of industrialization combined with brutal winters. Newspapers reported deaths, accidents, and charitable efforts, weaving a narrative of danger, resilience, and moral responsibility. These accounts ensured that winter's impact was not forgotten, shaping public awareness and eventually prompting reforms in housing, sanitation, and public health. By the late 1800s, the city had adapted incrementally. Streets were cleared more regularly, shelters became more common, and public awareness of winter dangers grew. Still, winter remained deadly, and its effects lingered in memory and culture. The human cost was high, but so was human ingenuity. People developed strategies, routines, and social networks that allowed them to endure when survival might otherwise have been impossible. In reflecting on these experiences, one sees that Victorian winters were not merely a backdrop to history. They were an active force shaping the city, its people, and its culture. They influenced architecture, clothing, labor practices, literature, and social reform. Winter was both a literal and symbolic challenge, cold, relentless, and impartial, yet also a catalyst for resilience, ingenuity, and community. The deadly winters of Victorian London did not go unnoticed by authorities, although change was slow. For much of the early 1800s, the government's involvement in public health was minimal. The Poor Law offered limited support, primarily through workhouses which were often cold, overcrowded, and unwelcoming. Families feared them as much as the frost outside. Yet, the mounting toll of disease, death, and suffering could not be ignored indefinitely. By the mid-1800s, reformers and social activists began advocating for improved living conditions. Edwin Chadwick, a prominent public health reformer, emphasized sanitation and drainage as vital to preventing disease during winter and throughout the year. Reports detailed the link between overcrowded, damp housing and outbreaks of cholera and influenza, particularly during winter months. Slowly, reforms began to target housing, drainage, and street maintenance improvements that directly reduced winter mortality. Public housing reforms, although gradual, marked a significant change. Model dwellings, often constructed by charitable organizations, provided slightly better insulation, ventilation, and access to clean water. These buildings did not eliminate winter hardship, but they represented an important step toward reducing the vulnerability of the urban poor. Combined with coal distribution schemes and rudimentary heating initiatives, these measures provided critical relief during the coldest months. Sanitation reforms had a profound impact. The city's drainage system, once insufficient and often blocked, was upgraded in the latter half of the 19th century. Cleaner streets reduced disease transmission, while better water supply and sewer systems helped prevent cholera outbreaks. Though winters remained cold and harsh, fewer people fell ill from preventable illnesses. The interplay between public health, infrastructure, and weather became clear. Survival in winter was not only about warmth, but also about sanitation and access to clean water. Education reforms also played a role. By providing better schooling environments and meals for children, schools helped reduce winter mortality among the youngest residents. Well-fed and clothed children were far less vulnerable to the cold, and lessons about hygiene further protected them from winter-related disease. Education became both a tool for social mobility and a protective factor against the harshness of winter. Coal supply and fuel distribution were another area of reform. Municipal and charitable schemes ensured that the poorest families received at least minimal coal supplies during winter. Though insufficient to make homes fully warm, these measures prevented some of the most extreme cases of hypothermia and frostbite. Families could survive longer in their homes without relying solely on improvised fuel sources. Cultural memory of winter also shaped public policy. Newspapers, pamphlets, and literature kept the public aware of the dangers and encouraged preparedness. Seasonal advice on heating homes, layering clothing, and preventing frostbite became widespread. Public awareness campaigns, coupled with charitable initiatives, helped reduce mortality in a city where nature and poverty had long conspired against survival. Winter also influenced architecture. Buildings began to incorporate better insulation, thicker walls, and smaller windows to retain heat. Chimneys were redesigned to improve airflow and prevent smoke buildup indoors. Even small architectural adaptations like more efficient fireplaces or higher ceilings to reduce damp improved residents' ability to cope with extreme cold. On a social level, winter fostered community networks. Neighbors relied on each other for warmth, information, and aid. Mutual support groups, informal cooperatives, and charity networks strengthened social bonds, which proved crucial during prolonged cold spells. These networks not only helped with survival but also reinforced a sense of community resilience that would endure long after winter's end. By the late 1800s, Victorian London had become more resilient, though still vulnerable. The city had not conquered winter, it never would, but its residents had learned to mitigate its deadliest effects. Sanitation, education, fuel distribution, charitable networks, and improved housing reduced mortality and made survival more predictable. The lessons learned in this period informed future public health policies and urban planning, shaping modern London's ability to withstand cold and disease. Winter remained a powerful cultural force. Dickensian depictions, frost fairs, and seasonal festivities ensured that the collective memory of harsh winters persisted. Families remembered stories of frostbite, frozen rivers, and sleepless nights by the fire. These memories, passed through diaries, newspapers, and literature, reinforced both the dangers and the ingenuity of past generations. Reflecting on these winters today, it becomes clear that they were not simply about temperature or snow, they were about the intersection of environment, society, and human resilience. Cold exposed inequalities, amplified dangers, and tested every aspect of life from housing and nutrition to community networks and government policy. Survival was as much a matter of social structure as personal strength. Even today, when modern heating, medicine, and infrastructure make winter survivable for almost everyone in London, the lessons of the 1800s remain relevant. Harsh winters teach us the importance of preparation, community support, and public health infrastructure. Victorian London's winters were deadly, yes, but they also forced innovations that would save countless lives in the generations to come. As winter receded and the thaw arrived, Londoners could finally breathe a little easier. Streets cleared, frozen rivers melted, and markets returned to a semblance of normalcy. Yet the memory of the past months lingered in every household, in every child's shivering recollection, in every adult's fatigue, and in every lost life. Winter had not simply been a season, it had been a test of endurance, ingenuity, and resilience. Looking back, it is clear why winters in 1800s London were so deadly. They were a perfect storm of environmental, social, and economic factors. Bitter cold alone was only part of the story. Overcrowded housing, inadequate heating, malnutrition, and rampant disease amplified the lethal effects of frost and ice. A poorly insulated home was not just uncomfortable, it could be deadly. Limited access to medical care and coal meant that even minor illness or exposure could turn fatal. The city itself, sprawling and industrial, trapped cold, smoke, and damp, creating a persistent environment of risk. Human vulnerability was magnified by social inequality. Wealthy families could endure winter with relative comfort, while the poor faced life or death decisions daily. How to allocate coal, whether to venture outside for work, how to feed children when resources were scarce. Winter revealed the deep disparities between classes, and survival often depended as much on social status and support networks as it did on personal determination. Yet, within this harshness, human ingenuity and compassion shone. Community networks, charitable organizations, and religious institutions provided relief. People shared coal, food, and warmth, reinforcing bonds that were critical to surviving months of relentless cold. Temporary joys, frost fairs, ice skating, Christmas festivities, and storytelling offered emotional relief and a sense of continuity in a city otherwise dominated by danger. These adaptations, both practical and cultural, highlight the resilience of Londoners in the face of extraordinary adversity. The deadly winters also spurred long-term societal changes. Sanitation reforms, public health initiatives, housing improvements, and fuel distribution schemes gradually reduced winter mortality. Lessons learned in the 1800s informed urban planning and public policy for generations. Architecture evolved to retain heat more efficiently. Schools and hospitals were reformed to protect the vulnerable. Even seemingly simple improvements, like cleared streets and insulated homes, saved countless lives. Cultural memory ensured that winter's impact remained vivid in the city's consciousness. Literature, diaries, and newspaper reports immortalized the struggles and triumphs of Londoners. Dickens' novels, often depicting the cold and squalor of Victorian streets, were not merely stories, they were documentation, reflection, and moral commentary on the human cost of winter. The collective memory of frostbitten children, frozen rivers, and overcrowded, smoke-filled homes influenced society, policy, and art for decades. It is remarkable to consider the psychological toll of winter. Extended darkness, dampness, and the constant threat of illness shaped behavior, routines, and even personality. Fear of freezing, hunger, or disease dictated daily schedules and social interactions. Yet simultaneously, these hardships fostered ingenuity, community solidarity, and resilience. Winter shaped not only bodies but minds, teaching lessons about preparation, empathy, and the value of collective action. Even today, the story of Victorian London's winters resonates. Modern heating, medicine, and infrastructure make survival far easier, but the historical lessons remain relevant. Cold, deprivation, and disease may be less deadly, but preparation, social support, and public health infrastructure are still crucial. Victorian winters remind us that environmental challenges are compounded by social inequities, and survival is rarely just a matter of whether it is a matter of society, planning, and human ingenuity. In conclusion, winters in 1800s London were deadly not because of frost alone, but because of the interplay between extreme cold, inadequate infrastructure, social inequality, disease, and human vulnerability. Every frozen street, every icy river, every shivering child, and every exhausted laborer contributed to a lethal environment. Yet, even within this peril, human resilience persisted. Londoners endured, adapted, and innovated, leaving behind lessons and legacies that would shape the city for centuries. The story of these winters is a story of survival against overwhelming odds. It is a story of community, ingenuity, and the human spirit in the face of relentless adversity. It is a reminder that what we often take for granted, heat, shelter, food, and safety, was once a daily struggle for millions. And it is precisely why, when we reflect on the history of London, we remember winter not merely as a season, but as a force that shaped the lives, society, and culture of one of the world's great cities. Winter in Victorian London was deadly, but it was also transformative, teaching lessons about human endurance, social responsibility, and the necessity of innovation in the face of environmental and societal challenges. The frost may have claimed lives, but it also forged resilience, compassion, and progress, a paradoxical legacy as chilling as the winters themselves. Even after exploring the daily struggles, societal reforms, and personal stories of Victorian winters, there is more to consider. Winter in 1800s London was not only physically deadly, it also shaped culture, memory, and the psyche of the city in subtle but lasting ways. Consider the environment. Coal smoke, fog, and frost combined to create an almost permanent haze in winter. The famous piece of soot fogs were not just picturesque, they were suffocating, reducing visibility and contributing to illness. People described walking through a cloud of cold, thick, smoky air that clung to skin, hair, and clothing. Streets were slippery with ice and mud, rivers slowed or froze entirely, and the smell of waste and coal smoke permeated the air. Every breath was a reminder of the city's fragility and the danger lurking in winter. Food scarcity remained a constant pressure. Winter disrupted supply lines, delayed deliveries, and made fresh produce a luxury few could afford. Families relied on root vegetables, preserved foods, and occasionally charity meals. Bread, porridge, and thin soups became staples. The diet, poor in nutrients, weakened bodies and immune systems. Malnutrition combined with cold made people more susceptible to disease, meaning that winter was as much a season of illness as it was of frost. The industrial workforce adapted in creative ways. Factory owners sometimes heated workshops with coal stoves, though these were inefficient. Workers layered clothing, sometimes repurposing rags or scraps for warmth. Children, sent to work in textile mills or coal yards, were especially vulnerable, yet many developed routines that allowed them to survive. Some learned to use body heat efficiently, huddle together during breaks, or perform small physical exercises to stay warm. That adaptation was a matter of survival, and ingenuity often determined whether a worker lived to see spring. Frost fairs, while briefly mentioned before, deserve closer attention. The Thames, when fully frozen, transformed into a citywide carnival. Vendors sold food, hot drinks, toys, and clothing. Skaters glided across the ice, children laughed, and even wealthy spectators came to witness the spectacle. Yet the dangers were extreme. Ice could crack unexpectedly, sending people or carts into freezing water. These events reflected a human desire to reclaim joy and mobility despite the lethal conditions surrounding them. Winter also influenced fashion. Layered clothing, heavy wool coats, fur-lined boots, gloves, and hats were more than styled, they were essential for survival. Those who could afford proper winter attire had a significant survival advantage. The poor, on the other hand, relied on hand-me-downs, patched garments, or improvised coverings. Clothing became a literal shield against death. The Thames itself was both a lifeline and a hazard. Freezing disrupted trade, threatened food supplies, and endangered fishermen. Ice carried risk, yet also offered temporary recreational opportunities during frost fairs. The river, frozen yet bustling, became a microcosm of Victorian resilience. People adapting to winter, finding work and play in spite of danger. Personal diaries add another layer. One account tells of a family that survived on bread and thin soup for weeks, burning old furniture to heat their home. Neighbors pooled coal and food, ensuring that no child went completely without warmth. Stories like these highlight both the severity of winter and the persistence of human solidarity. Each act of sharing was a small victory against a season that could so easily claim lives. Even minor innovations helped. Improved chimney designs, better stove efficiency, and makeshift insulation could mean the difference between life and death. Knowledge of simple survival strategies, wrapping oneself in layers, huddling for warmth, boiling water for hygiene was often passed orally or through community observation. Experience became a survival tool, and collective knowledge was crucial during the harshest months. Winter also shaped artistic expression. Paintings, sketches, and literature captured frost-covered streets, smoky skies, and the resilience of Londoners. The pervasive cold and fog created moods of melancholy, endurance, and sometimes hope. Writers like Dickens and illustrators like George Cruikshank immortalized winter's struggles and joys, ensuring that the lessons and memories of these deadly seasons were preserved for future generations. Finally, consider the psychological impact. Extended darkness, damped conditions, and constant vigilance against cold and illness-induced stress, anxiety, and fatigue. Families coped through routines, community networks, and seasonal rituals. Play, storytelling, music, and shared meals provided relief, fostering resilience and reinforcing social bonds. Winter was not merely endured, was experienced collectively, shaping not only bodies but minds. In this extended view, it becomes clear that winters in 1800s London were multifaceted threats that combined environmental hazards, social inequities, and human vulnerabilities into a deadly force. Yet they also catalyzed innovation, solidarity, and cultural richness. The frost may have been lethal, but it also forged resilience, creativity, and community lessons that would echo long beyond the final thaw. Winter in 1800s London was not just cold, it was suffocating, oppressive, and often deadly, largely because of the city's living conditions. The poor lived in overcrowded tenements, often with multiple families crammed into a single, damp room. Walls were thin, floors cold, and ventilation nearly non-existent. Dampness seeped through brick and mortar, creating mold that exacerbated respiratory illnesses, especially among children. Heating was a constant struggle. Coal was expensive, and even when families could afford it, stoves and fireplaces were inefficient. Many homes had only a single fireplace to warm multiple rooms. Families clustered near the fire, trying to share whatever warmth they could, but the cold crept through every corner of the house. Those without coal relied on blankets, layered clothing, or huddling together for body heat measures that offered only temporary relief. Coal smoke added another layer of danger. London's industrial boom meant that coal was burned not only in homes but in factories, workshops, and streets. Smoke and soot filled the air, combining with the fog to create the infamous pea soup smog. This thick, choking mixture irritated lungs, worsened respiratory disease, and made even short walks outside exhausting. Breathing in cold, polluted air day after day weakened immunity and increased susceptibility to pneumonia, bronchitis, and influenza. Poor drainage and sanitation compounded these conditions. Waste often piled up in the streets or flowed into open sewers, which froze in winter, creating both foul smells and a breeding ground for bacteria. Contaminated water supplies spread disease, and indoor plumbing was rare. Many families relied on communal pumps or shared taps, which became gathering points for sickness during the cold months. The wealthy fared better, but they were not entirely spared. Large houses were drafty, and heating multiple rooms with coal or wood required careful management. Servants and staff worked to maintain fires, and windows were often shuttered or covered to retain heat. Smoke from nearby industries and neighboring homes still infiltrated wealthier districts, a reminder that even comfort had its limits. Housing conditions directly influenced winter mortality. Overcrowding facilitated rapid spread of disease, while damp, cold rooms weakened the body's defenses. Coal smoke and polluted air worsened respiratory illnesses. The combination of structural inadequacies, environmental hazards, and extreme weather made survival a daily struggle. Yet despite these challenges, Londoners adapted. People learned to insulate rooms with cloth, hang tapestries to block drafts, and layer clothing. Families developed routines to conserve heat, taking turns near the fireplace or sharing body warmth at night. Community networks sometimes allowed neighbors to share coal or temporary shelter, but these measures were stopgaps, not solutions. Winter in Victorian London exposed the deadly consequences of industrialization and urban overcrowding. The very features that fueled the city's economic growth, coal factories, dense housing, also magnified its dangers. Living conditions were not merely uncomfortable, they were a matter of life and death. Every breath of smoke, every damp wall, and every night spent shivering in poorly heated rooms represented a risk that could tip the balance between survival and tragedy. Winter in 1800s London did more than chill the streets, it disrupted work, transport, and commerce in ways that made survival even harder. For laborers, frostbite and exposure were daily risks. Outdoor workers, dockhands, market porters, street vendors, and river laborers faced freezing winds, icy streets, and snow-covered surfaces. Clothing was inadequate. Gloves and boots were thin or worn, and hours of exposure in bitter cold could result in serious injury or death. Factories, too, were harsh winter environments. Textile mills, foundries, and workshops were poorly insulated, often heated by a single stove or fireplace. Cold machinery made work more physically demanding and dangerous. Workers' hands stiffened, dexterity decreased, and accidents became common. Slippery floors, frozen metal, and fatigue from shivering all contributed to workplace injuries. Employers often expected full attendance regardless of whether. Many laborers risked frostbite or illness just to earn their daily wages. Transport was another critical challenge. Horse-drawn carriages, omnibuses, and carts struggled on icy, snow-packed streets. Rivers and canals froze, disrupting shipments of coal, food, and raw materials. Rail transport, though growing, was also affected by frost, ice on tracks, and delayed schedules. These disruptions not only threatened livelihoods but also aggravated food and fuel shortages, further endangering the city's most vulnerable. Markets, both formal and informal, were heavily influenced by the weather. Street vendors faced frozen produce, reduced foot traffic, and increased spoilage. Farmers delivering goods from the countryside struggled with icy roads and delayed shipments. In winter, prices for essential items like coal, bread, and vegetables often spiked, leaving working-class families to make impossible choices between heat, nutrition, and survival. Children working in factories or assisting in family trades were especially vulnerable. Long hours and freezing conditions, combined with inadequate clothing and poor nutrition, left them susceptible to frostbite, illness, and exhaustion. For street children, winter meant scavenging in harsher conditions, sleeping in alleys or doorways, and navigating the dangers of frozen streets and rivers. Their work was a matter of survival, and each day carried risk. Despite these hardships, Londoners adapted. Workers developed routines to preserve warmth, layering clothing, huddling together during breaks, and timing outdoor tasks to daylight hours. Vendors improvised with protective coverings, makeshift shelters, or heating small stoves in market stalls. Transport operators learned to navigate icy streets carefully, and communities coordinated to ensure essential deliveries of coal, food, and medical supplies. Cold winters also influenced economic patterns. Some industries thrived despite the weather. Coal merchants, firewood sellers, and winter clothing producers saw increased demand. Others, like fruit importers or certain trades reliant on outdoor labor, struggled with disruption. Seasonal adaptation became a necessary part of urban life, shaping routines, economic planning, and social behavior. The harsh winter environment highlighted the fragility of Victorian London's industrial economy. Labor, transport, and markets were all vulnerable to frost, ice, and snow, revealing how environmental conditions could amplify social inequality and mortality. The city's growth depended on human labor and industrial output, yet these were constantly challenged by the relentless winter cold. Ultimately, the relationship between work, industry, and winter was one of survival and adaptation. Laborers endured the cold to earn wages. Transport workers risked icy roads to deliver essential supplies, and markets adjusted to meet the demands of a frozen city. These struggles illustrate not only the physical challenges of winter, but also the resilience and ingenuity of Londoners determined to keep the city functioning despite the harshest conditions.